What if the bloodiest island battles of the Pacific War weren't won by the Marines who stormed the beaches, but by men who were never supposed to exist? What if the US military developed a method of warfare so psychologically devastating, so ruthlessly efficient at exploiting human biology, that every record of its use was immediately classified under false designations? And what if the warriors who perfected this nightmare weren't trained at West Point or Quantico, but learned their craft in the canyons and mesas of the American Southwest? Before we reveal what's hidden in Section 7G of the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, in the restricted Pacific Theater collections at the Marine Corps Archives in Quantico, and in a single file cabinet at the Naval History and Heritage Command that requires 2 separate security clearances just to know it exists, I need to tell you something important. First, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story is reaching. Second, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is walking a razor's edge. We're covering operational details that powerful institutions spent 80 years burying. The only reason these stories survive is because you choose to hear them. Your subscription isn't just support. It's an act of historical preservation. What if everything you were taught about World War II was carefully edited to hide the most disturbing military operations ever conducted on foreign soil? What if the warriors who fought with methods so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that their own government sealed the records for 80 years, were not foreigners, but Americans? Before we reveal what's hidden in Section 7G of the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, in the restricted Pacific Theater collections at the Marine Corps Archives in Quantico, and in a single file cabinet at the Naval History and Heritage Command that requires 2 separate security clearances just to know it exists, I need you to do something. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Second, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is walking a razor's edge. We're covering operational details that powerful institutions spent 80 years burying. The only reason these stories survive is because you choose to hear them. Your subscription isn't just support. It's an act of historical preservation. On March 19, 1944, 72 hours before the invasion of a volcanic fortress in the Central Pacific that would officially claim 6,800 American lives, a coded message was transmitted from SINCPAC headquarters in Pearl Harbor to a nondescript training facility outside Yuma, Arizona. The message contained only 8 words. The ovens are ready. Send the canyon people now. Within 18 hours, a C-47 transport lifted off from a desert airstrip that appeared on no aviation charts. Its cargo manifest listed the passengers as indigenous consultants for terrain analysis. The truth was far darker. Those men landed on a staging island whose name has been redacted from every document we've recovered. According to a single surviving logistics report, declassified by accident in 1998 and immediately reclassified, they were met by a Marine colonel who had specifically requested that no stenographer, no clerk, and no photographer be present for the briefing. The meeting took place in a Quonset hut, positioned at the edge of the airfield, far from the main encampment. The colonel's first words, preserved in the fragmented testimony of a Navy corpsman who overheard them through the thin metal walls, were these: "Gentlemen, what I'm about to ask you to do has no precedent in modern warfare. You will receive no medals, no commendations, and if you are captured, the United States government will deny your existence. Your mission is not to kill the enemy with bullets or bombs. Your mission is to make the island itself kill them." One of the indigenous scouts, identified in that same fragmentary testimony only as the elder from Second Mesa, responded with a question that would later be referenced in a classified ethics review conducted by the War Department in 1947. "You want us to wage war the way our grandfathers did when the cavalry tried to starve us in the canyons. You want us to turn stone, sun, and thirst into weapons. That knowledge does not come without a price. The man who learns to kill by taking away water does not forget how. If you want us to teach your Marines this, you must accept that we are not making soldiers. We are making something older." The colonel opened a metal case. Inside were tools that had no place in any military arsenal: modified digging sticks, bladders for transporting and sealing water, fine mesh screens for blocking airflow, and climbing equipment adapted for moving silently across volcanic rock. This was not the story of the Navajo code talkers, whose brilliance has been rightfully honored. This was something the military never wanted the public to understand: the deliberate weaponization of environmental extremes and the application of indigenous knowledge to create warfare that killed silently, invisibly, and without evidence. No official designation for this unit exists in any accessible military database. The men who have spent decades reconstructing its operations refer to it by the name that appeared in a single, declassified naval intelligence summary from 1946: the Desert Scouts. To understand why this program was buried, you have to understand the problem the military was facing. February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima. The naval bombardment had lasted 3 days, 22,000 shells, reducing the island's surface to ash. Intelligence projected light resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese weren't on the surface. They were beneath it, dug into 11 miles of interconnected tunnels carved through volcanic rock. When the Marines landed, machine gun fire erupted from cave mouths that appeared on no map. The volcanic sand made every step a struggle and held heat like a furnace, radiating temperatures above 110 degrees, even in February. By day 3, over 2,000 casualties. 6 months earlier, Peleliu had revealed the same nightmare. Fewer than 11,000 Japanese held out for over 2 months against a Marine division 3 times their size. The secret was geology, a maze of coral limestone caves with ventilation systems and water cisterns hidden so deep that American intelligence never located them. Temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees. Marines carried minimal water because planners said the island would be secured in 3 days. It took 73. Men hallucinated from dehydration, drank from contaminated pools, or broke ranks searching for water, and were cut down by snipers positioned to exploit their desperation. The Japanese had prepared for this environment. They understood that survival itself was tactical advantage. Somewhere in Pacific Command, in planning sessions that left no minutes, a question was asked: if conventional soldiers cannot survive in this environment, who can? A memo from November 1943, marked "Confidential, Eyes Only," survives. The author's name is redacted. The indigenous peoples of the American Southwest possess survival and tracking skills developed over thousands of years. Selective recruitment for Pacific Theater cave operations represents a viable alternative to current high-casualty tactics. A handwritten margin note reads, "Pursue immediately. Classification, maximum." The telegram that arrived at the San Carlos Apache Reservation on December 14, 1943, was brief and formal. The subject line read, "National Security, Ancestral Knowledge Required." The telegram was delivered by a civilian contractor driving a War Department vehicle with government plates. He handed it to the tribal police officer, stationed at the San Carlos Apache Reservation's administrative office, refused to wait for a reply, and drove back toward Tucson without speaking to anyone else. The officer, Thomas Nashio, a veteran of the First World War, recognized the format immediately. He'd seen telegrams like this before, though never addressed to the tribal council as a collective body. Usually they informed families that a son or husband had been killed in action. This one was different. It requested the presence of senior tribal leadership with knowledge of traditional survival practices at a meeting to be held at 1800 hours on December 18th at a location identified only by grid coordinates. The signature block was blank, except for a typewritten designation. Office of Strategic Services, Southwest Theater. Nashio brought it to Chairman Joseph Tisnolthos, who read it 3 times before speaking. "They want to know how we survived when they tried to kill us," he said finally. "Now they want us to teach them so they can kill someone else." The council met that evening in the traditional meeting house, away from the Bureau of Indian Affairs office where federal employees might overhear. 12 men attended, the eldest members of tribal leadership, men who had been children when Geronimo surrendered, raised by parents who remembered fighting the cavalry in the Dragoon Mountains. The debate lasted 4 hours. Some argued that cooperation was exploitation, that the government would take their knowledge and discard them just as it had taken their land. Others pointed out that young Apache men were already dying on Pacific Islands. At least this way, their knowledge might save Apache lives. Victor Atsiti, who had fought in the Apache Scouts during the final campaigns in Mexico, offered a perspective that would prove prophetic. The Army learned 40 years ago they could not beat us in our own land. They only won when they turned some of us against the others. Now they face an enemy who fights like we did, from caves, from high places, from positions they cannot be driven from. They know their weapons do not work, so they come to us. We can refuse and watch our sons die using tactics that do not fit the ground. Or we can teach them what our grandfathers knew, but we should not pretend they will thank us for it. When the war is over, they will want to forget that they needed us. The council voted to attend the meeting. On December 18th, 12 Apache elders made the journey through the Sonoran Desert to the coordinates specified in the telegram. The facility they found was unmarked, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by military police who checked no identification because they'd been told to expect visitors who carried none. The conference room was windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb, casting long shadows across concrete walls. Seated across from the elders were 3 men in army uniforms, with no name tags and rank insignias that had been removed. The oldest officer, a colonel the Apaches would later refer to only by that rank, placed a leather folder on the table, but did not open it. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying exhaustion or something darker, "we are about to ask you to help us win a war using methods that will never be acknowledged by this government or any other. What we discuss tonight will be classified at levels that exceed even our nuclear program. We are losing men by the thousands on islands where our technology means nothing. The enemy has gone underground. Our bombs cannot reach them. Our Marines die in caves they cannot navigate. We need men who understand a different kind of warfare." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Peleliu, of Iwo Jima, of volcanic landscapes and cave systems that could have been the canyons of Arizona. "You fought the U.S. cavalry for decades in terrain exactly like this. You survived where we could not follow. You knew where water was hidden, how to move without sound, how to fight in darkness and heat. The Japanese are using your tactics against us now. We need you to teach us how to fight the way your grandfathers fought. Not the way West Point teaches, the old way." Tisnolthos studied the photographs for a long moment. "You want scouts?" The colonel shook his head. "We want more than scouts. We want warriors who can teach Marines to survive on a cupful of water, to track a man across volcanic rock, to enter caves where our soldiers freeze in terror. We want men who can turn the desert itself into a weapon. He paused. And we want this to remain a secret. There will be no publicity, no recognition, no records. When the war ends, this conversation will have never happened. Atsiti leaned forward. And what happens to the men who do this work? The colonel's silence was answer enough. They return to their lives and carry the secret alone. Tisnolthos looked at the other elders, then back at the colonel. We will provide names, but understand this. The knowledge you are asking for is not just technique. It is spiritual. It changes a man. Your Marines will learn to fight like Apaches, but they may not return as the men they were. The colonel nodded slowly. We understand the cost. By January 1942, the first volunteers arrived at a newly constructed facility 30 miles northeast of Fort Huachuca, in a box canyon that had once been Apache hunting grounds. The location was chosen deliberately. The military wanted the trainees to feel the presence of their ancestors, to tap into something primal that could not be taught in conventional boot camps. According to fragmentary records, 89 men entered the program during its active period. Only 34 can be conclusively traced to post-war documentation. The rest simply vanished from official records, their service erased as completely as the program itself. The training facility existed on no official map. A cluster of canvas tents and corrugated metal sheds arranged in a box canyon 30 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a single dirt track that was erased by wind within hours of any vehicle passing. The men who arrived in January 1942 were met by instructors who introduced themselves by function, never by name. The head instructor, an Apache veteran of the punitive expedition into Mexico, was called only the Elder. His first words to the assembled trainees became legend among the few who survived to speak of it. The Marines will teach you to shoot. We will teach you to make the enemy wish he had died by bullet. The regimen began before dawn, when the desert cold still froze breath into visible clouds. Trainees were awakened at 400 and given a single canteen of water that had to last until sunset, regardless of the day's exertion. The first week, men collapsed from dehydration. They were revived, lectured on their failure to ration, and sent back into the training cycle. Those who refused the lesson were removed from the program. By week 2, the survivors had learned to sip rather than gulp, to hold water in their mouths and absorb it slowly, to breathe through their noses to conserve moisture. Tracking instruction began with exercises that seemed impossible. Trainees were blindfolded and told to identify which direction a man had walked, based solely on the scent of disturbed sand. They learned to read the compression patterns in volcanic gravel, to distinguish between a footprint made an hour ago and one made at dawn by examining the edges where dust had settled. The Elder demonstrated tracking a man across bare rock by locating microscopic skin cells left on stone, by finding the nearly invisible scuff marks where boot rubber had contacted basalt, by reading the story written in displaced pebbles no larger than grains of rice. Heat conditioning was brutal. Midday exercises in full gear. Crawling across lava fields where surface temperatures exceeded 140 degrees. Men learned to identify the shimmer patterns above rock that indicated trapped heat versus the shimmer that suggested moisture. They were taught to locate water by observing insect flight patterns, by reading the slight color variations in cliff faces that indicated seepage, by digging in seemingly barren ground where certain plants grew and finding damp sand 18 inches down. The physical transformation was remarkable. Within 6 weeks, trainees' resting heart rates had dropped. Their sweat production had become more efficient. their bodies adapting to function in extreme heat on minimal hydration. They moved differently, steps carefully placed to avoid disturbing gravel, breathing controlled to minimize sound and moisture loss. They learned to fight in confined spaces using traditional weapons, war clubs designed for close-quarters skull strikes, obsidian-edged knives that made no sound when cutting, modified tools for blocking cave ventilation shafts. The final examination was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Each trainee was given a compass bearing and told to reach a destination 40 miles away through the most hostile terrain in the Sonoran Desert. They carried no food and one canteen containing 8 ounces of water. They had 72 hours. Instructors followed at a distance, watching but not intervening. Of the original group, only those who arrived within the time limit, still capable of combat readiness, graduated to deployment. The others were transferred to conventional units with records that made no mention of where they had been or what they had attempted to become. The C-47 made its approach to Peleliu at 02:30 hours on September 12, 1944, 3 days before the official Marine invasion. The aircraft carried no markings, flew below radar altitude, and appeared on no flight logs. Its passengers, 12 men designated in the pilot's sealed orders, only as geological survey team, wore marine utilities with no insignia, no name tapes, no identification of any kind. They jumped from 400 feet into darkness over the island's northern peninsula, an area intelligence believed was unoccupied. Intelligence was wrong, but the scouts landed in absolute silence, their parachutes buried within minutes, and melted into the volcanic landscape before the Japanese patrol investigating the aircraft noise arrived to find nothing. Their mission was reconnaissance, but not the kind the Marine Corps understood. They weren't looking for troop concentrations or artillery positions. They were mapping the invisible infrastructure that kept the Japanese garrison alive. Water sources, ventilation systems, supply routes between cave complexes. For 6 days, the scouts moved through terrain that would later kill Marines by the hundreds, and they did so without being detected once. The team leader, identified in the single surviving after-action fragment only as Scout 1, later described their methodology in a debriefing that was immediately classified. "We tracked them the way our grandfathers tracked deer. At a cave entrance, you read the dust. Footprints tell you numbers and timing, but dust tells you breath. When men enter and exit a cave repeatedly, their breathing disturbs the fine particles in predictable patterns. We could determine how many men used an entrance, how recently, and whether they were carrying heavy loads by the depth of their exhalation patterns in the dust." They identified water sources by methods that baffled Marine intelligence officers. One scout located a critical Japanese cistern by observing the flight pattern of insects at dawn, noting they flew in consistent vectors toward a specific ridge face. Another found a hidden spring by smelling the difference between wind coming from dry caves versus those with moisture deep inside, a distinction imperceptible to anyone not trained in desert survival. They moved across loose volcanic gravel that crunched like broken glass under Marine boots, but the scouts passed in silence, placing each foot with precise pressure distribution, rolling from heel to toe in a gait that dispersed weight and minimized sound. The intelligence they gathered was unprecedented. Hand-drawn maps showing not just cave locations, but the connecting tunnels Marine engineers didn't know existed. Precise counts of water storage capacity. Ventilation shaft locations marked with coordinates accurate to within 3 feet. Detailed notes on Japanese patrol patterns, shift changes, and the times when specific cave complexes showed reduced activity. They identified the central command cave by tracking the movement patterns of officers, men who walked differently, whose boot prints showed less wear, who were saluted by others. On the sixth night, Scout 1 used a mirror and moonlight to signal a Navy destroyer offshore. The Morse code message was brief. 23 primary water sources located. Ventilation map complete. Recommend insertion prior to invasion. The scouts exfiltrated the same way they'd arrived, extracted by submarine from a beach the Japanese believed was too exposed for American operations. When the Marines landed 3 days later, they carried maps the scouts had created. The maps showed things conventional reconnaissance could never have discovered, which caves would become death traps when their ventilation was blocked, which water sources supplied multiple defensive positions, which tunnel networks could be collapsed to trap entire companies. Marine commanders didn't understand how the intelligence had been gathered, and they were never told. The official records credited aerial reconnaissance and local informants. The scouts who had spent 6 days behind enemy lines, who had provided the targeting data that would save hundreds of American lives, received no recognition. Their insertion never happened. Officially, they were never there. The tactics that followed would ensure the Desert Scouts were erased from history. What they did on Peleliu and later on Saipan went beyond reconnaissance, into a form of warfare so ruthless that even hardened Marine commanders requested the operational reports be sealed immediately upon receipt. A fragment from one such report, declassified accidentally in 2003 and reclassified within 48 hours, describes operations that violated every conventional protocol. Indigenous personnel successfully interdicted enemy water supply using non-standard methods. Result: enemy combat effectiveness degraded by estimated 60% within 72 hours. Minimal ordnance expended. Recommend continuation, but advise extreme classification. The scouts had learned that the Japanese defensive strategy depended entirely on hidden water cisterns that allowed defenders to outlast American attacks. Once those cisterns were located, the scouts didn't destroy them. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they contaminated them. Using methods taught by elders who remembered cavalry attempts to poison Apache water sources, they introduced biological agents, decomposing organic matter placed in ventilation shafts that fed into water storage areas, mineral compounds that caused severe dysentery, and in some cases, simply sealing the cistern so completely that Japanese engineers couldn't locate the blockage. A Marine intelligence officer's diary, discovered in estate archives in 1989, describes witnessing the results. Found Japanese positions abandoned without fight. Bodies showed extreme dehydration, despite being only 200 yards from what their maps indicated was a water source. The source was there, sealed behind what appeared to be natural rockfall. Our engineers said it would take a week to clear. The Japanese had died waiting. The ventilation warfare was worse. The scouts used their tracking skills to locate the carefully concealed air shafts that made the deep cave systems survivable. These shafts were engineering marvels, hidden among natural rock formations, designed to disperse smoke and draw fresh air into tunnels 50 feet underground. The scouts blocked them systematically using techniques that left no evidence of sabotage, collapsing sections with precisely placed rocks that appeared natural, filling shafts with fine volcanic sand that restricted airflow while remaining invisible from inside the caves, and in some cases, redirecting exhaust from one tunnel system into the air supply of another. Japanese defenders died of carbon dioxide poisoning in caves that showed no damage from American weapons. Others suffocated slowly as oxygen levels dropped, a process that induced panic, paranoia, and psychological collapse. Marines entering these caves days later found bodies with no visible injuries, men who had clawed at stone walls trying to escape an enemy they couldn't see or fight. The scouts also engaged in direct combat but only in conditions that favored their training. Inside the tunnels, where firearms were nearly useless due to ricochets and confined spaces, they used traditional weapons: war clubs for silent kills in darkness, obsidian-edged knives, and bare hands. A classified Marine Corps battle assessment from Saipan notes with clinical detachment: Cave Complex Tango 7, estimated to contain 200-plus enemy combatants. Preliminary assault resulted in 47 friendly casualties with minimal enemy losses. Indigenous unit inserted. The complex cleared within 18 hours. Enemy KIA, 198. Friendly casualties during indigenous operation, 0. Method of elimination, unknown. The psychological impact of the Desert Scouts became clear only after the war, when Allied intelligence officers began translating captured Japanese diaries and interrogating survivors. What they found was so unsettling that the documents were immediately classified under a designation separate from standard war records. A diary recovered from Peleliu, translated in 1946 and sealed until a partial declassification in 2001, contains entries that read less like military reporting and more like horror testimony. September 23, 1944. The Americans do not attack our position, yet we are dying. Sergeant Takahashi was found this morning in the lower tunnel, dead with no wounds. His face showed terror. The doctor says his heart simply stopped. 3 men now refuse to enter the deep caves, claiming they hear breathing in the darkness that is not their own. September 26th. Our water supply is gone. Engineers insist the cistern is full. They can hear it behind the rock, but cannot reach it. The collapse that blocks it appeared overnight and looks natural, but Private Yamamoto swears he heard scraping sounds in the darkness before dawn. Sounds that stopped when he called out. When we investigated at daylight, we found nothing. No footprints, no disturbance, just rock that was not there yesterday. October 1st. We call them Sunfire Spirits. They move through stone. Our sentries report shadows that cross open ground in full daylight without making sound on the gravel. When we fire, there is nothing there. But our men keep dying. Always in the darkness. Always without wounds. Always with expressions of fear. Interrogation reports from captured Japanese officers reveal even more disturbing details. A lieutenant from Saipan, interviewed in 1945, described encounters that his American interrogators initially dismissed as heat-induced hallucination. They were not men. Men make noise. Men smell of sweat and oil and tobacco. These smelled of dust and moved like wind. We would hear nothing, then find one of our sentries dead in his position, sitting upright, throat cut so precisely there was almost no blood. We set traps, posted guards in pairs, kept fires burning at cave entrances. It made no difference. Multiple reports describe Japanese soldiers dying of what medical examiners could only classify as acute psychological shock leading to cardiac arrest. These men were found in defensive positions, weapons unfired, showing extreme dehydration despite being within reach of water supplies. The medical consensus, recorded in a 1947 Naval Intelligence Assessment that remained classified until 2018, was chilling. The deceased exhibited physiological responses consistent with extreme terror sustained over extended periods. The body's stress response essentially cannibalized itself. They were, in effect, frightened to death. Perhaps most disturbing was the account from a Japanese company commander who survived Peleliu and was interrogated extensively in 1946. His testimony was deemed so psychologically unreliable that it was filed under stress-induced fantasy rather than tactical intelligence. On the 4th night, I saw one. I was positioned at a cave entrance watching the American lines when I became aware of presence behind me. I turned, and he was there, 3 meters away, absolutely motionless. He wore an American uniform, but his face, I cannot describe it. Not cruel, not angry, empty. He looked at me the way a man looks at an insect before crushing it. I reached for my weapon, and he was gone. Simply gone. I searched the cave for an hour. There was nowhere he could have gone, but he had vanished. The next morning, my second in command was found dead in the command cave. No wounds. His eyes were open. The desert scouts had become exactly what the elder had warned. Not soldiers, but something older. Something that killed with silence, patience, and the environment itself. They had turned the volcanic islands into hunting grounds and the Japanese defenders into prey. The psychological toll wasn't limited to the enemy. Several scouts, according to fragmentary post-war psychiatric evaluations, reported difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, describing themselves as still hunting long after the war ended. The official Marine Corps history of the Battle of Peleliu credits the capture of the Umabrogol Ridge complex to sustained artillery bombardment, flamethrower assault, and superior infantry tactics over a period of 6 weeks. The official casualty assessment attributes approximately 10,795 Japanese deaths to these conventional methods. But buried in the restricted archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command is a parallel set of documents that tells a radically different story. A statistical analysis conducted by Marine Corps Intelligence in November 1944, classified immediately upon completion, identified what the analyst called unexplained variance in enemy combat effectiveness. The report, partially declassified in 2004 before being resealed, notes that during a specific 11-day period in late September, Japanese resistance in the central cave complexes collapsed at a rate inconsistent with the level of ordnance expended and combat personnel engaged. The analyst's conclusion was carefully worded. Enemy losses during this period exceeded predicted casualties by a factor of 4.7 to 1. Conventional tactical models cannot account for this discrepancy. What the report didn't mention was that this 11-day period corresponded exactly with the insertion of 12 desert scouts into the Umabrogol complex. 12 men operating without artillery support, without air cover, without the flamethrower teams that received credit in official accounts. Cross-referencing dates with declassified summaries reveals a pattern across multiple campaigns. Sudden collapses in Japanese defensive effectiveness immediately following the arrival of personnel designated only as indigenous support staff. On Saipan, a post-battle ammunition expenditure report shows something remarkable. During a 7-day period in late June 1944, enemy resistance in the Tapochau caves decreased by 68%, yet ammunition consumption was 43% below the daily average. A Marine Battalion commander's personal log, donated to the Marine Corps Museum in 1993 and immediately restricted, contains an entry dated June 24th. 3rd Battalion was supposed to assault Cave Complex 7 this morning. When we arrived at dawn, the position was silent. Found 47 enemy KIA. No signs of explosive damage, no burn marks, no bullet impacts. Command says to report it as artillery kill. Those are the orders. The kill ratios are mathematically absurd. 12 scouts on Peleliu for 18 days. Estimated 2,000 plus Japanese casualties during their operational period, with fewer than 200 attributable to conventional weapons in those sectors. That suggests a per-operator effectiveness of 11 to 1 per day. Numbers that would require either supernatural ability or a form of warfare the official record could never acknowledge. A 1946 War Department memo explicitly addresses this. The indigenous personnel program produced tactical results that, if publicly disclosed, would not be considered credible. Recommendation: all documentation should be separated from standard after-action reports and maintained under separate classification to prevent statistical analysis that might reveal operational details inappropriate for public consumption. That recommendation was implemented with extreme thoroughness. The scouts' kills were reassigned to artillery units or flamethrower teams. Their names were replaced with serial numbers, leading to dead-end files. The weapons expenditure reports for sectors where scouts operated are either missing entirely or contain obviously falsified data. The scouts had become too effective to acknowledge. Their existence threatened the narrative that American technological superiority had won the Pacific War. So the records were altered, the statistics buried, and the men who had done the impossible were systematically erased from history. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. 6 days later, the Desert Scouts received orders to report to a facility outside San Diego for what the telegram described as debriefing and reassignment. The men who arrived, 34 of the original 89 who had entered the program, were met not by commanding officers offering commendations, but by military lawyers and intelligence personnel who made the situation immediately clear. There would be no medals, no service recognition, and no public acknowledgement of what they had done. Each scout was required to sign documentation that even today remains classified. A fragmentary copy that surfaced during a 2007 FOIA request before being resealed indicates the agreement included lifetime non-disclosure provisions, with penalties including court-martial and federal imprisonment. The document reportedly contained language describing their service as experimental methodology, rather than combat operations, a designation that conveniently exempted the program from standard veteran benefit protocols. Within 72 hours of signing, the scouts were processed out of military service with discharge papers that made no mention of Pacific Theater deployment. Their DD-214 forms listed their military occupational specialty as terrain analysis or cultural liaison, with duty stations exclusively within the continental United States. Several scouts later discovered their records showed them stationed at bases they had never visited during periods when they were actually operating behind enemy lines on volcanic islands thousands of miles away. The bureaucratic erasure was systematic and thorough. Service records were lost in warehouse fires at the National Personnel Records Center, fires that were real but suspiciously selective in what they consumed. Other records were simply refiled under false names or social security numbers that didn't match the individuals. When scouts applied for veteran benefits, they were told their combat service couldn't be verified. When they sought treatment for psychological trauma at VA hospitals, doctors found no record of overseas deployment and classified their symptoms as pre-existing conditions unrelated to military service. A particularly cruel detail emerges from tribal records at the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Several returning scouts applied for the modest financial benefits available to combat veterans under programs specific to Native American service members. Their applications were denied, with form letters stating that no record exists of combat deployment for the individual in question. One scout, identified in tribal archives only as JT, died in 1953 from complications related to tropical disease contracted during Pacific operations. His widow's application for death benefits was denied because official records showed he had never left Arizona during his military service. The psychological toll was devastating. These men had been transformed into hunters of human prey, had killed in ways that violated every conventional understanding of warfare, and then were told they could never speak of it. A 1952 Indian Health Service report from the Fort Apache Reservation, uncovered by researchers in 2015, notes an unusual cluster of severe depression, alcoholism, and what would today be recognized as PTSD among veterans of a specific age cohort, men who had served during the WWII, but whose families reported they never spoke about their service and became violently agitated when pressed for details. One scout broke his silence in 1968, giving an interview to a researcher studying Native American military service. He described operations on Peleliu in detail: the water source contamination, the ventilation shaft blocking, the silent killing in tunnel darkness. The researcher submitted his findings to the Marine Corps Historical Division for verification. Within a week, 2 men in civilian clothes visited the scout at his home. The conversation was never recorded, but the scout immediately recanted everything, claiming he had confused his own service with stories he'd heard from others. He refused all subsequent interview requests and died in 1974 without ever speaking publicly again. The Desert Scouts had been essential when the military was desperate. They had saved thousands of American lives by employing tactics that conventional forces could not match. But in peacetime, they became an embarrassment, living evidence that American technological superiority had required supplementation by methods the public could never be allowed to understand. So they were erased, denied, and left to carry alone the burden of what they had become and what they had done in the volcanic darkness of the Pacific War. The systematic suppression of the Desert Scouts didn't end with the disbanding of the unit. It continues to this day, maintained through a bureaucratic maze specifically designed to prevent historical investigation. Researchers who have spent decades attempting to document the program describe a pattern of obstruction so consistent and sophisticated that it can only be intentional. A 2012 Freedom of Information Act request, filed by a military historian seeking records related to indigenous personnel utilized in Pacific Theater cave warfare operations, was denied under multiple exemptions. The official response cited national security concerns, protection of intelligence sources and methods, and, most tellingly, potential harm to ongoing diplomatic relations. Ongoing relations with whom? Japan? Tribal nations? The denial letter didn't specify, and appeals were rejected without explanation. Documents that do exist are fragmented and scattered across multiple archives, under seemingly unrelated classification codes. Some are filed under experimental warfare techniques, biological. Others appear in collections related to cultural resource management or Native American liaison programs. A single operational report was located in 2003 in the records of the Army Corps of Engineers, misfiled in a folder about water infrastructure in the Southwest Pacific. The report described non-standard personnel achieving exceptional results in cave neutralization operations before the remaining pages were discovered to have been physically removed, leaving only fragments. The National Archives facility in Kansas City holds what researchers believe is the most complete collection of Desert Scout documentation, but access requires security clearances that exceed those needed for routine classified military records. A librarian who worked in the restricted sections before retiring in 2009 described, in an anonymous interview, a specific storage room designated 7G that contained materials related to indigenous warfare programs. According to this source, the room required 2 separate security clearances to enter and contained file boxes marked with tribal designations and date ranges corresponding to WWII Pacific operations. Subsequent attempts to verify this claim or gain access have been unsuccessful. Physical artifacts are equally suppressed. The modified tools used by the Scouts, the digging implements, water bladders, climbing equipment, and traditional weapons should have been archived as historical items or returned to museums. None have surfaced. A 2001 inventory of the Marine Corps Museum storage facilities listed several boxes containing non-standard weapons, Pacific Theater, restricted access. When researchers requested to examine these items, they were informed the boxes had been transferred to another facility with no record of the destination. Most damning is what happened in 2018, when a veteran's grandson discovered his grandfather's war journals in an attic, containing detailed descriptions of scout operations on Saipan. The family contacted the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, hoping to donate the materials. Within days, 2 Department of Defense representatives visited the family, explained that the journals contained classified information, and requested, politely but firmly, that they be surrendered to government custody for proper preservation. The family complied. The journals disappeared into the classification system and have not been accessible since. The few scouts who survived into the 21st century took their knowledge to their graves. The last confirmed member of the program died in 2003 at age 84, having never spoken publicly about his service. His obituary described him as a WWII veteran who had worked in support roles in the Pacific. His family reported that in his final years, suffering from dementia, he would sometimes speak in fragmented sentences about the caves and the darkness, and men who died without knowing what killed them. When lucid, he would deny having said anything and change the subject. The erasure is so complete that the Desert Scouts exist today only as fragments, a statistical anomaly in battle reports, a missing page in an archived document, an unexplained classification code, a veteran who won't speak, and a government that won't confirm. They accomplished what the Marine Corps with all its firepower could not, saved thousands of American lives using knowledge passed down through generations, and were rewarded with bureaucratic extinction. The locked archives remain locked, the clearances remain ungranted, and the story of the men who turned the desert into a weapon remains officially a story that never happened.